Right now, it's pretty clear that open source is not just fringe hobbyist activity. It has become a global movement.
All of our code is open source, all of the data available.
And to do it in a way where you can create a clear incentive that if you build something that is impactful on our network, you can receive more funding and you can grow.
If you're working in open source, hang tight, help is coming.
You have likely heard about open source projects and public good funding, but have you ever wondered how funders track progress and measure their impact on ecosystem? Well, now we have data-driven ways to monitor real-time analytics. Curious to learn more? Stay with us. Welcome to Ecosystem Project Demo, where we explore public good projects shaping the Ethereum ecosystem. This is episode 16, brought to you by Ethereum Ethcatherders, and I'm your host, Pooja. Today, we are diving into an exciting project that provides a free analytics suite to help funders measure the impact of open source software contribution on ecosystem health. Open Source Observer. This is a platform designed to track, analyze, and support open source projects by offering real-time insights into their contribution and impact. Today, with our guests, we'll explore how OSO works and its role in the open source ecosystem. We are joined by Rohit Malekar and Cervone from OSO team. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Pooja, fun to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It's great to have you both here. Before we get to know the project, I would love to take this opportunity to know you more, our guests more. May you please share a few words about yourself, your professional background, and journey within the Ethereum or blockchain ecosystem?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. My name is Carl. I'm one of the founders of Open Source Observer. Before getting into monitoring open source supply chains, I had a former life looking at the coffee supply chain and helping buyers of commodities understand where their product was coming from. And what was very interesting about that line of work is that the way of measuring the value was very clear. You could go to a store and see how much the store was selling coffee for. You could go and look at the export statistics and understand exactly how much each country was selling its coffee for. And you could also interview the farmers, the producers of the coffee, and they would all tell you the prices that they were receiving. But there was a real problem around figuring out where the coffee came from and tracing it all the way from the end buyer back to the producer. In the case of open source, it's kind of the opposite problem. There's actually a lot of traceability. You can identify all of your software dependencies. In the case of Ethereum projects, you can identify all of your users or your addresses, and you can see what other products they're using. But we don't really have good ways of valuing those contributions. And so I think the way I connect these things is that we're kind of taking the same skill set around trying to come up with better data to understand where things come from. But now, uniquely in the case of open source, we are trying to add value to that, identify how do we differentiate between different forms of contributions and start creating signal about the types of contributions that are most impactful or valuable.
Awesome. Great. Hey, everyone. Rohit Malekar here. I look into insights and partnerships at OSO. Before coming into the world of Web3, I spent my previous life in consulting and product management, got incredibly excited when I started tinkering about the potential of what blockchain and especially the financial rails of crypto could do for public goods as a whole, and then open source specifically. I worked at Gitcoin in their marketing team, writing blogs. That's where I met Carl. We were doing an article on hypersets at that time. My first job out of engineering was into data, and when the opportunity presented itself at OSO, it was the best of both worlds for me. I love writing and I love dabbling with data, and it had both. So yeah, it was just a matter of asking Carl, where do I sign? And yeah, long story short, that's how I found the OSO team. Incredibly excited about the journey we are having and happy to share more.
Very interesting. As I always say, that learning about people who are in the ecosystem always inspires many people out there. Like coming from coffee supply chain to open source public goods, quite a journey. I understand having Gitcoin like platform intermittent coming from Web 2 world to Web 3 is very good for transition because that again talks about public good. So I understand we are going to talk a lot more about public good, and we do have a presentation. So without further ado, let's jump right into it.
Great. I guess I'll kick off and then I'll hand off the next section over to Rohit. So I think the reason we're here and we're so excited about what Open Source Observer is doing and the opportunity to measure impact in the open is that, right now it's pretty clear that open source is not just some fringe hobbyist activity. It has become a global movement. And many of the world's most valuable companies and businesses and kind of organizations these days are kind of built on open source as a backbone. And not only is it this massive global movement that touches many different aspects of our economic lives, it's also truly a global phenomenon. If you look at this map here, which is coming from GitHub data, it's basically showing how over the past 4 or 5 years or so, the percentage of working age adults around the world that is kind of contributing open source code has been increasing. And it's been increasing across the world. And what you're seeing is that these borders between countries and teams are dissolving. And in open source, one of the beautiful things is that people can see what you're doing and they can show up from anywhere in the world and offer ways of contributing. So it's this really dynamic, decentralized movement that I don't think has many parallels, at least in kind of the legacy world, in terms of how we think about governing it and how we think about funding it. So we are really amazed by the momentum that seems to be building behind open source. And one of our strongest motivations is figuring out how we can fund it better. So if we look at the size of open source, it's large. If it were a country, it would be one of the larger countries in the world. However, if we look at how much funding is going towards open source, it's actually very small. I think right now it's somewhere, if it were an economy in its own right, if you were to add up all the money that is going to fund open source, the budget would probably be somewhere between Fiji and Swaziland. So definitely not like the largest economies that you can think of, despite the fact that it's touching so many people and engaging so many aspects of the economy. So many people have had this analysis before, but we need better ways of funding open source. And the thing that got us really excited about the opportunity in the Ethereum ecosystem is that crypto networks actually offer a new model of funding open source. And for them, funding open source is not like the fifth priority. It's actually one of the first or second priorities, because all of crypto is built on being able to verify the state, where things are coming from. And that is kind of necessary as a first order problem. And so many ecosystems say, in order to have a vibrant, decentralized ecosystem, we need to solve the problem of funding all of our dependencies and having a range of different teams that are contributing to this. We see one of the areas where this is happening most, like the greatest velocity, in the L2 space, where each layer 2 is basically looking to bootstrap its own economy. And in doing so, they want to allocate their tokens through grant programs that can incentivize different types of contributors to build on their chain. So that means everything from DEXs to on-chain applications to developer tooling that makes it easier to deploy. There's a desire to fund these things and to do it in a way where you can create a clear incentive that if you build something that is impactful on our network, you can receive more funding and you can grow. And in doing so, you create this flywheel where there's more growth that leads to more network fees accruing to the layer 2 foundation. And then they can reallocate those in areas that incentivize future growth. So this is not just a pipe dream. There is actually significant funding that is moving into this. We need to update this chart here. This is, I think, captured last year, but there is hundreds of millions of dollars that are flowing from crypto projects to a range of open source teams. And what is also unique about the way that this is happening is that there's a lot of people collaborating or funding the same thing. In some cases, they might not be aware that they're collaborating, but they're often mixing their funding together in such a way that it is benefiting some kind of public good that extends beyond just the things that are required on their network. There are various examples of this. Optimism is one. We've also worked with other ecosystems like Gitcoin, Octant, and in many cases, you see similar projects that are showing up and receiving funding. And part of that is an acknowledgement that these are really foundational public goods that serve a variety of needs, and therefore they need some kind of sustainable funding. So we're very excited about a number of things here. If I were to recap them, number one is that you have this growing open source movement. Number two, that open source is really critical to the success of the Ethereum ecosystem. Number three, there's actually powerful funding infrastructure that is being built to fund all of these different types of teams. And number four, what you're seeing is that actually there's a lot of commingling of funds to support these kind of public goods that are necessary for more than one ecosystem. So that's all of the stuff that is happening to fund this ecosystem and to map it. And what we are doing at Open Source Observer is trying to make these types of contributions, these relationships between contributors, between projects, and the impact they create for different networks much more visible. An analogy that we sometimes use is that in the case of finance, you have a lot of different sources of financial data. It could be anything from stock markets to news articles to analysts that are doing coverage of different companies. And then 20, 30 years ago, you had something called the Bloomberg terminal, which created a platform to bring all of that into one common place. And that was kind of instrumental to creating like the modern world of capital markets and finance that leverages all of this information and uses that to create various products. We see a similar opportunity when it comes to combining both the on-chain data that is already accessible to many people in the Ethereum community with other sources of off-chain data so that you can map the entire software supply chain and then use that to create robust impact markets. Again, there's other analogies we could draw, but we think that right now, this is an area where there should be much more intelligence. You could say like business intelligence, or we call it network intelligence, where people are actually looking at the impact that a team or product is having across a network of different open source projects and public goods. I think I'll give some examples here. So, two of the larger layer 2 ecosystems that we work a lot with are Optimism, the Superchain, and Arbitrum. And one of the things that is so powerful about these open data sets is you're actually able to look at something like the developers that are contributing code to different projects. And you can see what that graph looks like. Here's a visualization in the case of Optimism. Here's a similar visualization now applied to the Arbitrum network of contributors. And if you go to the next page, we can do the same thing for their user networks. So we can say, here's an address. This is the activity that's doing on Optimism or on the Superchain. And then we can take that same address and look at what it's doing on another chain like Arbitrum. All pretty basic stuff. The power, however, comes when you start actually layering these things on top of each other and defining different cohorts. So we can take an example here and say, let's look at all of the contributors that are working on, say, Optimism, and compare them to some other group. It could be everyone in Ethereum. It could be everyone that's included in Electric Capital's developer report. It could be everybody in Arbitrum. It could be projects that have decided not to fund. You can design different cohorts, and then you can compare a group that has received funding against them. In this example, one of the things that I think Optimism has done a really strong job of is funding different, open source teams, and that has attracted more developers not only to work on Optimism, to actually focus more of their attention and developer loyalty there. And so you can see that over time, in general, there hasn't been a huge change in the number of developers that are working on in the Ethereum ecosystem over the past year or two, but Optimism has been able to capture a larger share than what you might otherwise expect. This is just kind of one simple example, but ultimately, what we are most passionate about doing is identifying where is there some kind of significant difference that can be attributed to someone funding something. And if that's the case, then that creates a pretty strong signal that you should be funding more of that. And you can be designing experiments to reward different types of contributions and putting more funding into the areas that have the highest impact. This is kind of a expand your screen slide here, which shows all the different things that Optimism has funded over the past 5 or 6 years. What you can see is it's a lot of projects. There's a significant amount of funding that has gone into it. And what we want to be able to do is zoom in on any of these boxes here and help come up with clearer metrics for, what has this done and how do we compare that relative to some kind of a baseline or some kind of a counterfactual. Right now, we're at the point where we are still getting all the data together to do this. We are hoping soon to have real case studies where we can say, here's some examples of things that have been funded, and here's the way that you can strip out the impact that this funding has had over some baseline. And then ideally, we are able to actually show that this form of funding, this way of funding open source software, is actually much more impactful than the traditional way of doing some kind of an RFP or having a closed procurement process and just giving a grant to the team you know the best.
That's awesome. I think in the next section, we'll look at a demo on how all of this comes together. I think behind all of the visualizations that Carl talked about is the art of asking questions. That's where it all begins. And so we'll go through a simple line of inquiry, digging into the OSO data. We'll start scratching the surface and show sort of the potential of where it all begins. We'll take a look at a project. We'll go into the past, look at how the project's been doing over the last 6 months, look at their trends. Also, more importantly, in addition to the coding metrics, we'll also pull in their funding data. And then we'll end the demo cross-referencing how the funding data correlates to development metrics. We'll take the Gitcoin ecosystem as an example. But just as a reference, all of this data, all of the notebooks, a lot of the sample tutorials and queries, everything's available online on the website. I've added a link to the document as well. So anyone who's curious about a particular ecosystem or a particular project, feel free to dig in, and we'd love to have more people asking the right kind of questions and trying to get similar insights for themselves. Yeah, so I'll just flip to the notebook real quick. Hopefully this is all coming through okay. There are many similar notebooks available on the OS documentation site as well. Just to begin with, in case you're not very familiar with SQL, a lot of this may look like Greek, but I'll also call out the right data elements that we are able to inquire and why that matters. So a lot of the projects in OSO, the good entry point to start looking at that is to check out their GitHub repositories that are behind the project. So in this case, I'm just taking an example of open source and just querying for that organization. You'll get a list of all the GitHub repositories for OSO that we have been working on from this query. This is where things start to then, you can really start double clicking into the data. This is another example of a query where, as part of the data pipeline and creating models, one of the models in OSO is able to look back into 6 months and get sort of the health statistics of a project. Metrics including how many commits have occurred in the project's repositories over the last 6 months. What's the kind of contributor size? What proportion of those contributors have been new in the last 6 months? Number of pull requests that have occurred, and so on. Again, these numbers as a standalone metric may not mean much, but this is a starting point to say, hey, if I want to check in a project and get to know how the project activity has been evolving, you sort of get a complete picture of what the project is looking like, both in terms of community engagement, in terms of having active developers, and as well as the development velocity in the form of number of commits, pull requests, number of issues closed, and so on. But again, as I said, these numbers on a standalone basis don't mean much. What you can also then start looking is take a time series view of these same metrics and put them across the timeline and see how the evolution of the project has been coming along. So in this query, I'm checking into the number of full-time and part-time developers for a project, and I'm laying them over a timeline. And just to make things a little bit more clearer, I've just pulled in a visual of this as well. So you'll see a spike in terms of number of contributors, part-time contributors for a particular period. But then you can really start doing this at a project level, but also at a cohort level. So if you're a grant operator and you've funded a dozen or more projects and you want to take a look how each of these projects are trending over time, you can start adding more aggregation to this and just take a look at an individual project or a pool of projects to get more granular statistics. To get more specific, if you want to take a look at who these contributors are, this is a query that looks into the specific individuals that have been powering some of these metrics. And this is basically a starting point to do the analysis that Carl showed at an ecosystem-wide level. How are the contributors in Optimism or Arbitrum? What are the common projects they are contributing to, and how does that network look like? This is the starting point to do that. So in this example, we've just pulled in the names of individuals who have been contributing or specifically committing code to Open Source Observer. And if you laid, again, I'll just make it easy to look at in the form of a visual. Yeah, so over time, you will see the list of individuals who have been contributing code in terms of like actually committing code. Yeah, you will see Carl, Raven, Ray, who are some of the core contributors over time, but then you'll also see how the number of contributors have increased. There's more diverse contributions from multiple individuals over time. The other interesting thing that the OSO data mart contains is also the public goods funding across ecosystems. that have come into these projects. We have data across Optimism, Gitcoin, Open Collective, Octant, and a few other ecosystems. So you're now really able to also look not only in the development metrics and what the projects have been doing, but also see what kind of funding they've been getting. So in this example, this is just a basic query. I've looked at Uniswap over time, and then a list of funders that Uniswap has been getting public goods funding from. But again, as a standalone funding metric, this doesn't mean much. But to Carl's earlier point, we can start combining metrics, and that's where we start to build more correlations. So in the next query, what we've done is we've taken a look at Gitcoin as an example. We've looked at the last 12 months of funding that Gitcoin has offered, and then we have correlated that data with the project's development activities. And then you start to see some interesting cross sections. There's a lot happening in this graph, but just to give an example, on the x-axis, you have the funding that's flown to the project. On the y-axis, you have the number of commits per developer. So you're basically normalizing your development activity by your team size. You will see some large bubbles here like L2Beat was received significant funding, but it also shows relatively high velocity. But any projects that are below a certain threshold, let's say you pick a number, 20 commits or per developer or last 6 months, and then you start to see exceptions. So as a grant manager, as a grant operator, you can really start zeroing in terms of profiling the projects, in terms of who's doing well, who might need some specific kinds of help, and so on. So this is just one example of trying to pull in correlating the funding data across your development metrics. All of these are very foundational queries that build upon a lot of the modeling work and the pipeline that makes all of this possible. So on the next slide, I just wanted to give a quick preview of the architecture that does all the magic in the visualizations. Again, this is a fairly busy slide, but just to focus on the top half, that's the infrastructure that serves the data from the OSO. So if you're a data scientist or a data engineer, one of the big pieces of this architecture is our data warehouse, which sits in Google BigQuery. So you can, as a data scientist or as a data analyst, go into BigQuery and use any of the models at any of the stages in the pipelines to query them and also write your own models on top of BigQuery. The projects are also able to get this data out of an API, as well as we have a basic reporting infrastructure in the form of a web app on our website as well. That infrastructure is powered by an OLAP database. That's ClickHouse that you see at the bottom. That's basically where the data is given to the API and the front-end web app. We also do a lot of the time series calculations, and we use SQL Mesh for that. All of the pipelines and the data moving and the orchestration across the entire architecture, we use Daxter to enable that. I think one takeaway for everyone here is that all of our code is open source. All of the data and the models are on BigQuery, as well as available through GraphQL on the API. And the infrastructure in itself is open. So really, it's an invitation for people who are curious about public goods, who are passionate about linking impact back to where the financial plumbing is. This is the place to be. We welcome everyone to start tinkering with the data. We have tons of examples on our documentation to get started. Yeah, so that's all about the architecture. I think as we go into the last leg, we also want to talk about why some of this work is challenging and what keeps us going. So yeah, over to you, Kyle.
But one question that we commonly get is, why is this on BigQuery, and how do we ensure that we're able to have various sources where people can interact with this data? And so one thing I just wanted to share here, probably the best place for people who are interested to kind of connect and figure out what's going on is through our docs page. It's a pretty large amount of data that we've tried to connect. So like more than 100 terabytes or so that are being scanned on a regular basis. And I think the part that is unique about what OSO is doing is we are not kind of creating any new source data. We are trying to connect data that comes from GitHub, that comes from dependency graphs, that comes from blockchains, that comes from funders like the ones Rohit mentioned, Gitcoin and Optimism and other grant makers. And oftentimes, if you're a data scientist, you will spend 80–90% of your time just figuring out how to connect these different data sets because they have different project naming conventions, or there's just a lot of data that you need to scan. And so we've tried to make that work of actually joining up the data as easy as possible. What BigQuery is really good at is making it so that anybody can connect to the data if they have a Gmail account, and they can get access to very large data sets without needing to kind of replicate them on their own servers or pay an expensive amount to scan the data. So it allows people to come in and get what they need without needing to necessarily set up their own indexing infrastructure or incur their own cloud bill. Unfortunately, given the size, it's also the amount which is very difficult for people to run locally. Once you get beyond several gigabytes, it becomes pretty unrealistic for people, the everyday hobbyist data scientist to be, creating a local copy of this data and doing the analysis on their machine. So in any case, we are looking to support a variety of different ways for people to access the data. Right now, BigQuery is a good kind of middle ground because people generally have access to Google products, and they have a pretty good way of allowing you to connect and share public data sets. But as Rohit also mentioned, all of this infrastructure is completely open source. Even all the jobs that are running, anybody can see that. If you want to fork it, if you want to take it elsewhere, people are welcome to do that, very permissively licensed. So I just wanted to get those things out before we go any further. If we go to the next slide, the really big problem that we're trying to get more people to focus on is how do you do a better job of allocating funding across some portfolio projects? If all you care about is funding 5 projects, then you can probably do that pretty well. But if you want to scale to a network of hundreds, potentially thousands of open source projects, then it is useful to have some data in the loop. And what we've typically seen, if you go to the next slide, is that people are quite good at identifying things on the short tail, the most popular projects that everybody has heard of. And on the other hand, you can pretty easily filter out the projects that are kind of side projects on the long tail that probably don't have much adoption beyond, say, Rohit just doing it and having fun with it, or it's like a hackathon, didn't last more than a couple of weeks. So these things are pretty easy to get at using superficial metrics, like some of the ones that, stars and number of contributors and so on. The real search space, though, is kind of in the middle here. So identifying the next Uniswaps, the next projects that are going to have a really outsized impact, and identifying, are there any signals that we can see now that they should be funded more, and that can accelerate their growth, that can accelerate their impact. So we definitely believe that data can play a role in this problem, especially as you're trying to extend the search space to many hundreds or thousands of teams and projects that are contributing various forms of open source software. One of the first things that people often cite when we talk about using metrics and funding teams based on metrics is Goodhart's Law. So if you're not familiar, there's a great XKCD cartoon which outlines the concept of Goodhart's Law. The basic issue is that as soon as you create a metric, people are going to try and game it. And once you've gamed it, it's no longer a good metric anymore. And so obviously this is a big problem, particularly in the crypto space where people are laser focused on finding the next incentive to farm. This is a very big risk. Obviously, we think it's a problem that is worth solving. We think it's a hard problem, but ultimately it's not, we don't want to hide behind the bogeyman of Goodhart's Law and say we should never look for better ways of funding these things. We should always keep the funding ecosystems small and constrained and based on a select group of people making decisions. We do want to open it up. We do want to create a more merit-based funding mechanism. And doing so means that we have to do the hard thing of coming up with better ways of measuring impact and testing whether we're actually able to get better funding outcomes if we use those metrics. The next section just talks about some ideas for how you might do this. So in Web 2, there's this concept of the bus factor, which is basically how many engineers could get hit by a bus and the project could still survive. Obviously, it's a bit of a morbid example here, but you can actually calculate this systematically across a number of projects by seeing, looking at over a period of time, maybe 1 year, 2 years, how much of the code is coming from, one person or several people. And, we applied this in the case of Optimism a few months ago. And what you can see is that actually most of the projects are, pretty susceptible to having a low bus factor, meaning that it only takes one person. And if that person is knocked out, then more than 50% of what has been happening, could be at risk. And so I think one goal, if you're trying to mitigate bus factor, will be trying to measure how many new contributors are joining a team and contributing to a project. So you have the bus factor over here, and then a good complement is the growth of new contributors that are joining a project. code contributions or other types of contributions to that project over time. The next thing that we might be interested in is kind of looking at the on-chain aspect. So we have we've talked about the developer activity, and now we want to layer in what kind of on-chain activities associated with that project. And maybe in this case, you care about having users that are coming in and doing a lot of things over a monthly period, not just ones that are trying it once and then churning, but are ideally spending a good amount of time using the product. And if you kind of combine all these metrics together, I think that is where you get like the real value, not just having one metric and funding that, but actually layering them together in some way. So if we take this example, again, this visual here might be hard to see if you're not looking closely, but you can kind of plot on the x-axis the number of contributors, on the y-axis the number of users, and then we can segment these different projects based on their bus factor. And so once you've done that kind of layered segmentation of projects, you can actually get into some pretty interesting funding hypotheses. So maybe you can identify a group of projects that have a lot of users, but a very small team, and therefore a high bus factor. And so if we give them more funding, if we give them retro funding, is there a way that we can actually increase developer activity and reduce bus factor over time, increase the number of new contributors that are coming in, while at the same time still retaining a large number of their on-chain users? Another example might be, here's a really big team, but they don't have a lot of users. Maybe there should be an incentive program which is focused on user retention. So you target those types of projects, and the goal that you want to impact is user retention. And then, another area that I'm personally quite passionate about is the idea of trying to give fast grants to a large number of smaller projects. Instead of spending a lot of time reviewing them, let's say, okay, here's a number of projects. They've clearly been around for more than a weekend. So there is some commitment to this existing. People are putting time into it. Why don't we just skip all of the grant application process and just give them a fast grant and see what happens? And so we distribute a large number of these smaller grants to a set of projects and see what happens. These are all the types of experiments that we think are really interesting and can be supported by this type of data. The next quip that I evoke here is that, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think George Box is the one who supposedly said that. But the reality here is that any of these models that we create is not going to be perfect. It's not going to solve all the problems. If anything, it might be useful for standing up a particular grant program. But ideally, all of these metrics, all of these programs are evolving based on feedback and interaction that happens in the real world. That kind of feedback loop is absolutely critical. We believe that's one of the most important roles for governance and oversight of these programs, but we don't want to create the expectation that you can come up with some beautiful model, deploy it, and then all of your funding issues and all of your impact is going to be taken care of. So I shared this before. Again, the best place for people to start exploring some of the data is by going to our docs page. And then if you go to the next one, I added one more slide here, which just shows an overview of some of the different data sets that you can connect. And I think that will set Rohit up to give an overview of some of the jobs to be done and where we need help from the community.
Awesome. So yeah, as we saw, there is a lot of intersectionality across data from a technical sense to get best insights out of it. And there is also a lot of intersectionality that we need in terms of talent or people who can unlock that data. And that's the intersection between people who are passionate and committed about public goods, who believe that there is a financial plumbing possible for stewards of public goods and make a living out of it, but also people who understand data and can connect the dots. And that's the role of impact data scientists. It doesn't exist today. You won't see this role in any of the job portals, but hopefully in the next 15 to 18 months, we would have changed that by bringing more rigor to impact management. Also, really delving into the art of asking questions and creating hypotheses and then validating it against data and making more informed decisions in terms of who gets funded, how much, and being able to connect the money with the impact. Yeah, so that's hopefully what another dent we would like to make in terms of the role. We spoke about how folks could get involved. We are also, the rest of the team is on Discord. I've added the link in here. If you get stuck or hit a wall or need pointers on how to get started, just drop into Discord and we'll help you get started. But yeah, that's all of the presentation. Happy to get into questions.
Thank you for sharing. That was fascinating. I love the mention of open source is not limited to hobbyists anymore. Yes, of course it is not. Now big techs are also getting involved with it. So that was interesting. And there was a mention of Bloomberg Terminal. So for people who may not be aware of this term, basically Bloomberg Terminal is a computer system that is provided for financial professionals with real-time market data and news and trading tools. So data is definitely a powerful tool in open source, and OSO is clearly working with a lot of data and the infrastructure. So we can consider OSO as Web3 BT, as they have already mentioned in their presentation. So that was a genius idea there. And you also shared a lot of different grant ideas, especially I love the idea of fast grant for smaller projects. I know there are some grant providers who believe in that, but I think coming up more providers with this idea would be helpful for smaller projects. So thank you so much for sharing this presentation. Going ahead, I have a few questions which I would like to just share in order to understand it better and just to make sure that this is something that is really existing today. So we understand that we are trying to talk about open source, we are trying to talk about contribution, but when we are talking about a project like open source project, it's not only the code contribution, like it also involves some different kind of contribution like community management, advocacy, marketing, and so on and so forth. Do you think OSO can also track non-code contribution, and if there are any measures to quantify them?
Yeah, if you go back to one of the slides that we shared here, the goal of Open Source Observer, go to the one that shows all the public data sets, Rohit. So I think the only strong line that we're drawing is that the data set should be open. And so we don't really have a strong opinion about like the form factor, but the important thing is that there be some kind of public data set that can be connected to other sources. And so examples of this right now that exist, so you can take social networks like Farcaster and Lens, and you can identify people that are working on projects. And if someone has joined their username or their handle or their channel or something else, then you can actually have some way of tracking other forms of activity, other forms of engagement that might be happening that are related to that project. Many open source projects, they will project manage by creating GitHub issues and commenting on issues and doing that kind of work in the public. That type of stuff is already pretty well captured. We have also been trying to partner with a few other ways of getting purely qualitative data. So for instance, we have Ethereum attestation service, other projects that are creating attestation data about projects. OP Atlas is an example of a data set that is creating kind of a rich project registry of people that are kind of working on optimism. What we've tried to do is make it so that anybody who has a new data set can do so really easily, and they can bring it on here and they can start indexing the data and then doing the incredibly important, but oftentimes invisible work of connecting the data sets together. I can't stress how much of this ends up being like a data engineering problem, just getting the data to line up and connect. There's a fair amount of work that is required just to do that. We try and do as much of that as possible so the community can really focus on figuring out what they want to measure and designing, calibrating their metrics to do that. So even though we've kind of gotten our start focused on software contributions, by all means, we would love to see this expand to many other types.
That is quite comforting to know that, because we in the Web3 ecosystem, there are so many people working in so different capacity. It's always a good idea to get everybody incentivized accordingly. While we were talking about contribution, I think one of the selection criteria, or maybe the metrics criteria, was how many open source contributors are involved with a project. I remember a different kind of chart that was beautifully done, but I am trying to understand the position of projects which may not be heavily adopted, but they may have some very good projects. I wonder how OSO can help get decent amount of funding for these projects.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that one again. I think that one of the challenges that we certainly face is that people think that any of the metrics that we share are ones that we believe should be funded against. And in many cases, what we're actually trying to do is highlight a variety of examples of metrics that might be useful, but might be completely irrelevant to the thing that you care about. So I think many open source projects will say, we don't want just random contributors showing up and doing things here. That's actually not useful. And so you probably would not want to fund that particular metric. On the other hand, one of the things that as an ecosystem we do like to measure is how many developers are coming and working on things in Ethereum and sticking around, even when the price goes down and there's market volatility. So the power here is kind of figuring out, what is the thing that you want to track over time, and what are some good metrics that will give you a sense of how things are going. But when it comes to funding things, oftentimes you need to be much more specific. You need to have a much narrower definition of what kind of positive outcome you want to see. And then, maybe you fund against that. And then you can still zoom out and see, okay, has this impacted developer activity in a positive way? So again, sometimes some of the most immediate things that you care about incentivizing are not going to be the things that you actually would want to measure in the long run to get a sense of overall health of your ecosystem.
Yeah, and the thing I'll add is what the data also helps in profiling the pool of projects that you may have as an ecosystem. There's an entire spectrum, as Carl mentioned. There are hackathon projects that don't get any more contribution outside the weekend. The hackathon may have happened all the way to hobby projects with good potential, and then OG projects that have been in the ecosystem. And I think all of us in Web3 have been realizing is that you really need multiple strategies of funding to serve each of these different demographics of projects. So one of the things that the data does help highlight are which are projects with high velocity in spite of being a small team. And if that's the focus of funding, you can use the data to then spotlight those projects and then treat them differently versus like a large project with established reputation who's getting recurring funding.
That is awesome. Yes, this is a very big ecosystem, and some of the open source projects are widely recognized, but there are certain projects which, despite their value, remain under the radar. So, just wanted to make sure that these high impact projects are not overlooked. Good to know that there are other data points that funders may consider, and definitely make use of OSO.
Yeah.
I wanted to have a follow up on contribution side itself. Like, it has been recently noticed that there are some contributors which are genuine contributors. They are actually adding value to the project. However, because it is a popular concept of airdropping, there are some users which are just trying to make nominal or maybe not so significant contribution just to make sure that they're a part of contributor or set. Is there a way to capture like who is making meaningful contribution and they should be a part of this? Do you think projects can take any help from this tool?
Yeah, so like as we said before, as soon as you start funding against something, then it's going to change how people view that. So even something that previously no one would have ever thought of, like opening up an issue or making some tiny little edit in your documentation, now a lot of people want to do that because they think they might get included in some kind of an airdrop. So unfortunately, there is just going to be this like cat and mouse game where you do one thing, people respond, then you have to do the next thing. It's another reason why, we strongly believe that these metrics should be evolutionary and they have to respond to the way that the ecosystem, the system responds to the metric itself. What I think we would like to see more of is that projects can use all of these same data sets in the same way. So if they wanted to, for instance, they could identify, okay, here is a contributor. What else have they done? What's kind of their reputation? What's their track record? Are there any people who's kind of working on this project that have some connection? So there's some examples in our tutorials, but you can see ways of doing that kind of like network graph analysis. And typically that has been designed for funders who care about the reputation of projects. But the same tooling could be done for projects themselves to identify, where's this person coming from? What's their history? Should they be included in our airdrop and so on? I think we're still very early days. Obviously, what we don't want to see happen is that because so many people are now turning to GitHub as a source of identifying people that qualify for an airdrop, that now people are overburdened by getting lots of random pull requests and lots of issues and so on. And as a result, people start going closed source, so they start doing less things in public. That would be a very sad outcome. But I think, we do have the tools to detect this kind of behavior. I hope people can kind of take advantage of the data and use that in a way where they're able to do some of the filtering or kind of create their own reputation graph.
Yeah, and that's a power that really gets unlocked to Carl's earlier point on bringing all these boxes on a level playing field, normalized and easy for the community to tap in. And this view didn't look the way it did 12 months ago. And hopefully there'll be a lot more boxes on this view 12 months from now. And the more data sets, the more on-chain footprints we're able to connect to, I think the more resilient ways we can have to build reputation, whether it's for a builder or a user, any persona.
Very interesting. And I'm looking Open Source Observer as a tool which is going to help funders a lot. So that's why my questions are mostly related to that, because I have noticed like in Ethereum ecosystem, there are certain GitHub repositories which are like considered for airdrop. So for the airdrop provider, if they have to spend, say, for example, 100,000, they may have to end up spending 300,000 because the additional 200 are just fixing typo in there. So
Right.
if we can make use of this tool and try to like separate those things, we can perhaps get meaningful contribution instead of just adding the repository with spam. So that's good to know.
So
One
a few of the things that, oh, sorry, I was just going to say
no,
one other thing that we have been doing is kind of partnering with different people that want to come up with like a trusted developer reputation score. So like OpenRank, one of the data sets at the bottom here is an example where you can basically take any peer-to-peer graph. It could be forecaster activity. It could be activity on a blockchain network. It could be activity across a set of GitHub repos and figure out ways of like coming up with a trust score for every contributor. And so hopefully here, you can figure out where you want to set the threshold and say, okay, we're not going to reward anyone who's just coming and doing something very low value. And you can have an algorithmic way of identifying those people.
that is awesome. We are also creating a space, an ecosystem of like tools which can help the open source ecosystem. That's good to know.
Yeah.
In the same context, I believe there are certain other toolings that has been under like consideration for some of the grant providers. I heard about Karma Gap. That also helps funder to maybe learn about the impact the donation may have made on the community or the ecosystem. I wonder if you would like to highlight the high level or the basic difference between that kind of tooling and open source observer.
Yeah, like we're good friends with the Karma Gap team. We see it as fully complementary. I think they are trying to create an interface between projects and funders to, sign up, to have milestones, to do reviews, and so on. In our case, we actually don't want to have any new interface between projects and funders. We want there to be existing public sources, of which Karma Gap, is a good example of that. They use attestations as well, so that anybody might be able to come in and not have to, connect the Karma Gap data with the Farcaster data set. Ideally, that model connecting the two is already there. And so any ecosystem that is using Karma Gap to do milestone reporting can say, great, let me look at their milestones on Karma Gap and then join that on some other data set like developer activity or, their funding from Gitcoin, et cetera. So we want to make it easy for those types of grant making applications to play nicely together. They can also use some of the data as well. So they are kind of looking at the API and saying, okay, what might be useful to different audiences to understand what these products are doing.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, there would be different set of reporting for funders. So
Yes.
they are complementing it. Got the idea here. Very well. This was really interesting discussion. We are heading towards wrapping up of the session. But before we do you have any final message for the open source community?
Double click on Carl's earlier point that it's still early days. We are barely scratching the surface of what final state financial plumbing could look like, stitching together the dots between funding and impact. There's a long way to go. And this ecosystem does have the ability of getting lost in noises. So I'd say if you're working in open source, hang tight, help is coming. We are just one of the many projects trying to put together the building blocks to make it easier to build a career or make a living in open source. And hopefully the combination of crypto, the open rails, and open data sets a template for not only open source, but a lot of the other public goods. That's what keeps me motivated in this space.
Yeah, completely, fully agree with everything that Rohit said. A couple other things for people to keep an eye on if they're interested. So we're doing a collaboration right now with an initiative called Deep Funding, which is basically trying to map the entire Ethereum dependency tree and come up with some ways of valuing the different types of dependencies and their value for like a consensus client, an execution client, and ultimately all of Ethereum. So that's a product that Vitalik has been quite excited about. If anyone is interested in following along, you can go to deepfunding.org. There's also a few data challenges that are underway right now. So if anyone wants to start exploring these data sets, trying their hand at coming up with better algorithms for valuing different contributions, that's a great activity which is happening right now. We also do a lot of work with ecosystems like Optimism and Gitcoin. Right now, there's kind of a perennial search for better metrics and better algorithms. So if anybody knows those ecosystems well and wants to help out, there's kind of an open call for people to create metrics and to create models on top of those and help find better ways of valuing different types of contributions. We also have some new engagements right now with Arbitrum. So they're looking at identifying developers who have not been in the Ethereum ecosystem and figuring out how can we get them to contribute and use the Arbitrum stylus stack. So here they really want to identify developers that come in and are retained and build useful things in the Ethereum ecosystem. That's a really cool project that we're excited about. And yeah, again, the best way to get in touch, you can see our docs, you can reach out to us in Discord. We're building everything in public. If you want to join one of our stand-ups or one of our demo days, we have them every Tuesday. So we'd love to meet anyone from the community that's interested in doing impact data science with us.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing up defunding. I had that in my question list, but in short of time, I was just trying to finish up on time. But yeah, thank you for adding that. The project like defunding are in need of sources by which they can consider the project for funding. And then whatever formula they are using would be in place. It's a lot to learn from these kind of alternative fundings which are growing up in the ecosystem. So thank you. I look forward to maybe one day see some real world use cases as we have been mentioning here. This is in very early stage. So we would definitely learn more about it. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Thanks, Pooja.
Well, thank you so much, Rohit and Carl, for joining us here today and sharing such valuable insight about Open Source Observer and open source ecosystem as well. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in. And if you find this conversation inspiring, don't forget to check out Open Source Observer and see how you can contribute. Be sure to subscribe to Ecosystem Project Demo for more deep dives into the world of open source. Until next time, keep building, keep contributing, and stay open.